Singer Marvin Gaye was pronounced dead on a Sunday, the day before what would have been his 45th birthday. According to news reports, at the time, he had been shot inside his parents' home. His father, Marvin Gaye Sr., was taken into custody on suspicion of murder and ordered to undergo psychiatric evaluation. The headlines moved quickly, but one thing seemed to remain fixed for decades. Marvin Gaye's music would outlive him. For nearly 40 years, the world accepted his death as a straightforward family tragedy, a violent outburst between a troubled son and a rigid, aging father. But that was only the version the public was allowed to see. Because somewhere in an old police archive, buried under 4 decades of dust and silence, there was said to be a testimony from Marvin's father that almost no one ever heard in full. A final statement, a kind of confession, so unsettling that some believed it changed the way the entire story should be understood. Why did he say he no longer recognized his own son? Why did he suggest Marvin had been marked for death long before any trigger was pulled? And why were portions of his words quietly sealed away, with no clear explanation offered to the public? Tonight, we metaphorically open that locked box. We revisit the house, the history, the wounds, and the words that were never meant to reach the outside world. And what emerges from those shadows is a truth far more devastating than anyone could have imagined. Chapter 1. The House on Gramercy Place, a Family Built on Secrets. If you drive down South Gramercy Place today, the street looks peaceful, almost disarmingly calm. Palm trees sway in the breeze, white fences catch the Los Angeles sunlight, and the houses sit in quiet rows like harmless postcards from suburban life. But in the early 1982, one particular house on that street carried a weight no amount of sunshine could dissolve. 2110 1/2 South Gramercy Place. A modest beige 2-story home that, from the sidewalk, looked like any other middle-class refuge. But once you passed through its door, it became something else entirely. Behind its thick curtains and locked doors lay a family history stitched together with secrecy, strict discipline, humiliation, and wounds that had been festering for decades. This was the place where Marvin Gaye, one of the most transcendent voices of his generation, returned in the final months of his life. He did not come back to celebrate triumph, to relax, or to bask in his status as a legend. He returned to confront the very demons he had spent his entire life trying and failing to outrun. Marvin's story did not start with stages, hit records, or neon lights. It began with fear. Long before the Grammys, long before the world called him the Prince of Motown, long before What's Going On became a soundtrack for a fractured nation, he had simply been a slender, a sensitive boy living in a house ruled by a man whose authority felt absolute. Marvin Gaye Sr., a preacher rooted in a strict apostolic faith, demanded obedience the way other men demanded air. God, in his eyes, was the ultimate ruler. He was the enforcer of that divine will. And the children, especially Marvin, were expected to submit completely. When Marvin resisted, even in the smallest ways, there were consequences. Physical consequences. People who knew him later in life recalled how he flinched at sudden noises, chose his words carefully, apologized too quickly, even when he hadn't done anything wrong. These were not the habits of a global superstar basking in admiration. They were the reflexes of a child who had grown up, never knowing when the next blow would fall. His mother, Alberta, was the fragile barrier that stood between her son and his father's rage. She would throw herself over Marvin's small body, absorb the force when she could, and when she couldn't, she would hold him afterward, whispering comfort over his trembling shoulders. Marvin adored her. He feared his father. And that fear followed him like a shadow. It did not disappear when he was 16. It did not fade when he turned 25. It was still there when he was 44. But fear wasn't the only presence inside 2110 Gramercy Place. Jealousy moved through that home like smoke slipping through cracks. When Marvin's fame erupted, neighbors cheered, the world danced. Radio stations spun his records nonstop. The charts burned with his name. But inside the Gaye household, his success didn't heal anything. It deepened the fractures. Some people claimed that Marvin Sr. resented the glare of his son's spotlight, resented the screams of women calling Marvin's name, resented the streams of money flowing in from records he neither liked nor understood. Others whispered something even darker, that the father, once the unquestioned head of the home, could not bear living in the shadow of his own child. Whether those whispers were completely accurate or not, the tension they described became another unspoken law of the house. You did not celebrate Marvin too loudly, not in front of his father, not under that roof. Despite it all, Marvin continued trying to love the man who had raised him, even when church members murmured about Pastor Gaye's harsh methods. Even when relatives suggested the father never truly believed Marvin was man enough. Even as the emotional distance between them stretched wider, like a gulf no apology could bridge, every gesture Marvin made, every gift, every visit, every attempt at reconciliation seemed to evaporate as soon as it reached his father. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice started to speak, a truth he never wanted to face. My father will never accept me. By the early 1980 seconds, Marvin's life was collapsing under the weight of another war, one no belt, sermon, or hit record could fix. Drugs, paranoia, financial ruin, shattered relationships, creative exhaustion on the outside, he was still a legend. On the inside, he was coming apart. Tour dates gave way to sleepless nights filled with doubt. Studio sessions turned into hours of staring at the walls. Fame, once intoxicating, now felt like a poison slowly working its way through his system. In that vulnerable freefall, he made a choice he had once promised himself he would never make. He went back to his father's house. To strangers, it looked like a son returning home to regroup. To anyone who truly knew the history, it was the most dangerous place he could have chosen, because the house hadn't changed. The rules were the same. The man who enforced them was the same. When Marvin walked back through that front door, he wasn't a superstar, a pioneer, or a musical genius. Inside those walls, he was once again a child living in the long, cold shadow of the one person whose acceptance he had craved his entire life but had never received. The old wounds opened almost immediately. Arguments resurfaced, judgment sharpened, disappointment thickened the air until breathing felt like work. Friends said Marvin looked haunted. Even Alberta saw it in his eyes. The same house that had contained his childhood fears had now become the stage for his final breakdown. Night after night, the same thought stalked him. The same sentence he had spoken for years in interviews, in journal entries, and in late-night confessions. One day, my father will kill me. People thought he was exaggerating. They assumed it was just the paranoia talking. They believed he was simply drowning in his own darkness. But what if it wasn't paranoia? What if Marvin was the only one who truly sensed what was coming? What if, after decades of conflict, silence, resentment, and spiritual warfare inside that house, he could see the inevitable more clearly than anyone else? Because in the spring of 1984, that prophecy he had repeated again and again stopped feeling like a distant fear and began to sound like a countdown. Chapter 2. 1983. 1984. Marvin returns home to face his demons. By the end of 1983, Marvin Gaye was no longer the glowing figure audiences remembered from the Midnight Love era. The stage lights had dimmed, and behind them there was a man quietly coming apart. He canceled concerts, vanished from rehearsals, and spent endless nights alone in anonymous hotel rooms, lying awake and staring at the ceiling as if something unseen hovered just above him. Friends later described him as jumpy, withdrawn, worn down in a way that no amount of sleep could repair. When the final stretch of the Midnight Love Tour fell apart, Marvin did not protest, did not fight the decision. He simply stepped away from the music, from the crowds, from the roar of applause, as though the noise of the world had become unbearable for a mind that was already splintering. And then, in that fragile state, he made a choice almost no one saw coming. Instead of escaping to a quiet retreat or surrounding himself with people who might shield him, Marvin went back to the very place he had spent most of his adult life trying to avoid. His parents' house at 2110 South Gramercy Place. When he crossed that threshold in the winter air, it was as if the house swallowed him whole, just as it had done when he was a frightened child decades earlier. The shift in him was immediate. The hands that had once held microphones with effortless poise now trembled when he lifted something as light as a glass of water. His shoulders stayed tight, as though bracing for impact. His eyes darted around rooms, restless and unsettled. At night, the smallest sounds, the creak of a floorboard in the hallway, the rumble of a car rolling past outside, sent jolts through his body. He began scanning every window, double-checking the locks, pulling curtains closed, even in the middle of the day. He unplugged clocks because, he said, their ticking was too loud, too sharp. There were times when he would stop in the middle of a sentence, his voice trailing off as he turned to stare into an empty corner, silent, like he was listening to something no one else could hear. Inside that house, the nights stretched longer than the days. Marvin barely slept. He paced the floor. He muttered under his breath. Sometimes he sat upright in bed until dawn, clutching a pillow to his chest, terrified of what might happen if he let himself drift off. On the worst nights, he cried. Not with the sobs of a man breaking down in public, but with the quiet, strangled tears of someone who no longer recognized the world or himself. Alberta would sit beside him on the edge of the mattress, her hand moving slowly over his back, the same gesture she had used when he was 10 years old, hiding from the sound of his father's footsteps in the hallway. Again and again Marvin told her, "I feel like someone is watching me." He never said who. He never explained why. He only insisted the sensation stayed with him, a constant presence in the room, in the house, in his mind. And beneath that storm of paranoia and exhaustion, another tension was building. His father, Marvin Gaye Sr., was still the same rigid, sharp-tongued patriarch who had ruled that address for decades. Even in old age, his presence filled the space like heavy furniture that no one dared to move. He had never truly approved of Marvin's career, the sensual lyrics, the love songs, the image of a sex symbol, the kind of fame that came with temptation and excess. The fortune that surged in and out of Marvin's life like a tide made little sense to him. And now, seeing his son return home broken, paranoid, in debt, and emotionally shattered, he did not view it as a man in agony. He saw a man who had fallen short. The tension between them thickened almost at once. No shouting was needed to feel it. It seeped into the house like humidity into the silence at breakfast, into the way Marvin avoided his father's gaze at dinner, into every clipped answer and stiff exchange in the hallway. The rooms felt smaller, as if the walls themselves had grown closer. Marvin tried to stay clear of his father, but the house was too compact, and the older man's voice carried like an alarm. Sooner or later, their paths crossed, and sometimes the conflict surfaced where no one could ignore it. One afternoon, Alberta walked into the hallway and found them in the middle of a heated argument. Marvin was shaking, his father's face flushed with anger, the air so charged it felt like the entire house had stopped breathing. Alberta stepped between them, her hands raised, trying to diffuse the moment. The argument eventually died down, but the look she saw in Marvin's eyes did not fade. It was the look of a man cornered, a man shrinking back into a childhood he had never really escaped. As winter bled into early 1984, Marvin's condition worsened. He began sleeping with a gun hidden under his pillow, his hand tapping the mattress to make sure the weapon was still there before he tried to close his eyes. He refused to let anyone open his bedroom door without warning and locked it from the inside whether he was asleep or wide awake. One evening, Alberta stepped into his room and found him sitting on the floor. His knees were tucked up to his chest, his head bowed, his lips moving in a frantic whisper. "Don't let them get me. Don't let them get me." She dropped down beside him, reaching out, but he recoiled, startled by even her gentle touch. The house absorbed everything, every whispered plea, every shouted word, every muffled crash hitting the floor. Neighbors later said they heard strange sounds late at night. Footsteps racing down the hallway at 3 a.m, the distant thud of something falling, fragments of arguments carried through the walls. By daylight, Marvin drifted through the rooms, with his head bowed, hands clasped together as if he were silently praying his way across a battlefield. And yet, he still tried to keep a grip on himself, on some version of normal. He dusted the living room. He helped his mother with bags of groceries. He apologized constantly for taking up space, for disturbing her, for things that didn't even require an apology. "I'm trying, Mom," he told her one afternoon. "I just want everything to be right again." But the harder he fought to steady himself, the more he seemed to slip away. That house was not a refuge. It was a mirror reflecting his deepest fears back at him. Every hour spent under the same roof as his father felt like an invisible rope tightening around his neck, a noose only he could feel. People close to him said he moved as though he were trapped in slow motion, each day dragging him deeper into a strange space where past and present blurred together, the terrified boy and the exhausted man existing in one fragile body. And as the slow weeks inched toward April, something else appeared in his eyes, a quiet, eerie awareness. The unsettling calm of someone who could sense a tragedy approaching long before anyone else even realized it was near. For years, Marvin had repeated one chilling prediction, sometimes with a nervous laugh, sometimes with a tremor in his voice, sometimes with deadly seriousness. "My father will kill me one day." Most people brushed it off. They said he was being dramatic. They assumed it was just another symptom of his darkening thoughts. But inside that house on Gramercy Place, those words no longer sounded like exaggeration. They felt like a script unfolding, a warning turning into a timetable. And as March slipped into the final days before April 1st, the walls of that modest beige home seemed to close in tighter around him, each argument sharper, each silence heavier, each night more unbearable than the one before. Marvin was slipping, his father was simmering, his mother lived in quiet terror, and that house, standing so calmly on a Los Angeles street, felt once again as if it were holding its breath, waiting for the instant when decades of fear, resentment, love, anger, guilt, and unspoken pain would finally collide in the most devastating way imaginable. Chapter 3. The final 48 hours. What really happened? The last 48 hours of Marvin Gaye's life unfolded inside a house already pushed beyond its emotional limit, a home where decades of silence, discipline, and unspoken wounds hung in the air like dust in a beam of light. On March 30th, 1984, the pressure that had been simmering for months finally began to crack open. Late that morning, Marvin sat at the dining table, surrounded by bills, insurance forms, and letters he barely remembered agreeing to. Papers were spread out in front of him like a scattered map of a life he no longer controlled. Then he heard it, the familiar, steady thump of his father's footsteps entering the room. His shoulders tensed before the older man even spoke. Their eyes met, and something cold settled over the space between them. Without any polite prelude, Marvin accused his father of hiding financial documents from him. His voice was tight, urgent, edged with a kind of panic that sounded less like anger and more like fear. His father answered with the same sharp, cutting tone Marvin had known since childhood. According to later reports, he insisted that nothing in that house truly belonged to Marvin anymore. Not the papers, not the money, not even basic respect. Alberta stepped in, slipping a trembling hand onto her son's arm, urging him in a soft voice to let it go. But her attempt to calm the storm only seemed to feed it. Marvin shouted that his father wanted control over everything, even the insurance money. The older man glared and told him that in this house, he wasn't a legend, wasn't a star, just a man who had lost his way. The exchange didn't end because either of them cooled down. It ended because Marvin broke away, leaving the table and pacing the hallway like someone trying to outrun a tightening invisible grip around his chest. The following night, March 31st, the house grew unnervingly quiet. Alberta would later say in interviews that she felt something was off, though she couldn't put her finger on what it was. Around 9 p.m., Marvin's bodyguard stopped by to check on him after hearing about the argument. As soon as the man stepped inside, Marvin appeared at the top of the stairs. His eyes were wide, his voice shook as he ordered the guard to leave immediately. "I don't want anyone listening," he said, almost shouting, his paranoia flaring. The bodyguard tried to calm him, to reason with him, but Marvin's panic only grew sharper, more frantic. When the door finally closed and the guard walked away, Marvin slid the lock into place with shaking hands and retreated to his bedroom. Inside, he unplugged the television, checked the window latches twice, maybe 3 times, then sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. According to some accounts, he kept muttering under his breath, "Something's wrong. Someone's trying to take something from me." Downstairs, his father sat in his armchair, his body unnaturally still, his eyes fixed on some distant point in front of him. Neighbors would later claim they had never seen the old man so motionless, so inward, as if he were replaying a story only he understood. On the morning of April 1st, 1984, Alberta sat at the dining table, reading a letter. The house was quiet, but not peaceful. Her husband walked in and demanded to know what she was hiding from him. The tone was sharp, familiar, the same harsh edge that had cut through their home for decades. Upstairs, Marvin was already awake, fully dressed, as if he had never truly slept. He heard the tension rising in his father's voice, a sound he recognized instantly. Instinct took over. He rushed down the stairs, moving faster than his mind could catch up. He stepped between his parents, positioning himself as a shield, and told his father to leave his mother alone. His voice cracked, carrying not just anger, but the raw panic of a child who had spent a lifetime listening for that very tone. His father ordered him to stay out of it. Marvin refused. He yelled that the fight ended now and pushed his father not hard enough to be called a brutal attack, but enough to make the older man stumble backward. For the first time, Marvin had physically pushed back. The shock of that moment sank into the room, filling it with a silence more dangerous than any shouting match. Alberta begged them to stop, her words falling into a void neither man could hear any more. Marvin stood there, breathing heavily, his hands shaking, visibly rattled by what he had just done. His father stared at him with a cold, unreadable expression, then turned and walked down the hallway. Alberta thought he was stepping away to calm down. Marvin believed the confrontation was finally over. But the older man walked into his bedroom, opened a drawer, and took out the Smith & Wesson .38 revolver. The very gun Marvin had once bought for him as a misguided gesture of peace and protection. He gripped it in both hands and walked back toward Marvin's room. In the doorway, he paused. Inside, Alberta was still trying to soothe her son, still trying to pull him back from the edge. At approximately 12:38 p.m., the first shot tore through the quiet. Marvin barely had time to react. The bullet struck him in the chest, piercing his heart and knocking him backward onto the bed frame. Alberta screamed and lunged toward him. Witnesses later said her cries were so sharp that people nearby swore they heard them through the walls. Marvin's hand flew to his chest. His eyes were wide with shock, confusion, and an almost childlike disbelief. His father stepped closer, his face reportedly blank, emotionless. He raised the gun again and fired a second time. The next bullet ripped into Marvin's shoulder, spinning his body sideways and dropping him to the floor. Alberta fell to her knees, cradling his head, whispering, "Hold on, baby. Please, hold on." Her words spilling out through tears as his breath grew shallow and uneven, slipping away from her one fragile exhale at a time. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but inside the house, everything felt frozen, as if the tragedy had drained the life right out of the walls. Paramedics lifted Marvin's limp body onto a stretcher, blood soaking through the sheet that covered him. Alberta followed them out the side door, her body shaking, her face streaked with tears. On the porch, Marvin's father sat with his hands folded, strangely calm, almost detached, as though he had stepped out of his own actions and was now only watching the aftermath. According to some accounts, one paramedic quietly told another that he doubted Marvin would survive the trip. He was right. Marvin Gaye was pronounced dead shortly after arriving at California Hospital one day before his 45th birthday. Sitting in the back of the patrol car, Marvin's father reportedly told officers, "I didn't mean to shoot him, but something had to stop." Some officers later said his voice sounded flat, drained of emotion. Others believed he looked almost relieved, as if a weight he had carried for years had finally slid off his shoulders. The official documentation described the shooting as a domestic argument that turned deadly, but anyone looking deeper could see it was far more than that. It was the final collision of two lives, entangled by love and fear, faith and resentment, addiction and trauma, a father and son bound together by history and an impossible hope that somehow, someday, that house might become a place of healing instead of hurt. In the end, everything ended in less than 10 seconds. 10 seconds that silenced one of the greatest voices in American music and left behind a question that still hangs in the air 4 decades later. Was that Sunday afternoon a sudden explosion or the final eruption of a lifetime of pain that had been building from the very start? Chapter 4. The Lost Testimony. What the father said and what he didn't. The interview room at the LAPD station was small, windowless, and chilled just enough that Marvin Gaye Sr. kept rubbing his palms together for warmth. The air carried the faint scent of paperwork and disinfectant, the kind of sterile smell that clings to places where lives are dismantled on tape and in ink. It was the sort of room designed to make the truth feel too heavy to keep inside. Officers escorted him in carefully, almost gingerly, as if they weren't entirely sure which version of him they were confronting. The grieving father, the man who had pulled the trigger, the confused elderly suspect, or something far more complicated. When he sat down, the chair beneath him creaked. He looked smaller than he had appeared hours earlier on the front porch, smaller even than the stern, imposing figure neighbors had known for years. On the metal table, a cassette recorder clicked to life. A red light blinked. A pen tapped softly against the tabletop, keeping time with the quiet buzz of the fluorescent light above. Then came the first question. "Mr. Gaye, tell us what happened." His voice, when it finally emerged, was soft and thin, almost weightless. "I didn't want to kill him," he said. "I was afraid he'd beat me to death." That single line would later appear in newspapers, echo on television, and be repeated in magazine articles. It fit perfectly into the narrative. The public was given a domestic argument gone too far. An aging father pushed past his limit. A moment of fear turned lethal. It was simple, easy to repeat, easy to understand. But the instant those words slipped out, something in his expression seemed to change. His eyes drifted away from the officers and settled on a spot on the wall, as though he were staring straight through the cinder block, past the room, back through the decades that had brought him there. The officer asked him to continue. What followed, according to later accounts of the interview, never made it into the polished public summaries. It was not quoted widely in the press, not played on television specials, not highlighted in anniversary retrospectives. Instead, it existed only on a handful of neglected pages in a file that some people believed had been edited before it ever saw daylight. A file that, for years, was said to contain only fragments instead of a full confession. In a voice barely louder than the low hum of the recorder, he reportedly said, "I didn't recognize him anymore." The officer leaned in. "What do you mean?" "He wasn't my boy," the father whispered. "Not the boy I raised, not the boy I fed, dressed, took to church." He swallowed, struggling over the words. That one was an angel. This one was something else. He paused for a long stretch of silence, his chest rising and falling in slow, deliberate breaths, like each memory had to be pulled from somewhere deep and painful. "It was like something had taken hold of him," he continued. "Like he wasn't himself." To the officers in that small room, it may have sounded like the scattered thoughts of an old man under immense strain. But had those lines been made public at the time, they would likely have opened the door to darker speculation about possession, about addiction, about mental breakdown, about the darkness relatives said they had noticed creeping over Marvin in those final months. Instead, almost no one outside that room heard those words. They remained tucked inside the official transcript, with portions reportedly sealed or redacted, their full context withheld from the public narrative. When the officers asked if he felt remorse, his face twisted not into tears, but into a strange mix of guilt, defensiveness, and something that looked uncomfortably close to anger. "I didn't want him to suffer anymore," he said slowly. "He was suffering. You understand that, don't you?" One officer later claimed, off the record, that the tone didn't sound like a broken man begging forgiveness. It sounded, disturbingly, like someone who felt a grim kind of relief. In front of the cameras at the arraignment, he appeared fragile and bent, a man barely able to stand under the weight of what he had done. But in that interview room, only hours after the shooting, something in him seemed to have loosened. His shoulders had settled. His breathing had leveled out. He did not dwell on why he closed the distance between himself and his son instead of walking away. He did not explain the second shot, why he aimed again, higher, closer. He didn't deny stepping closer. He didn't deny pulling the trigger twice. He simply framed it as an end to pain, his pain, Marvin's pain, the family's pain, without ever fully acknowledging what that end really meant. According to some internal notes, there was a moment when he asked the officers almost timidly, "If I told you I'm glad he isn't hurting anymore, would you believe me?" The question reportedly stunned the room. One officer looked up sharply. Another lowered his eyes, unsure whether he was hearing a confession of compassion or something much more unsettling. Later, a detective would describe that line as the single most chilling moment of the entire interview. For the next hour, the father drifted between the past and the present, between language that sounded like regret and language that sounded like accusation. "He treated his mother like she was nothing," he said at one point, his words taking on a hard, defensive edge. "He yelled, he cursed, he pushed me, he became cruel." Yet almost in the next breath, his tone softened. "I loved him. I prayed for him. But he was slipping away into darkness, and no one would help him. No one could." The contradictions were impossible to ignore. The officers wrote them down, line by line, but making sense of them was another matter entirely. It was as if he were trying to hold together two different versions of himself, the father who wanted to protect his son, and the father who had spent years resenting his son's fame, lifestyle, and distance. More than once, he circled back to Marvin's success. "He had everything," he muttered. "Everything I never had." People adored him more than God. The bitterness in that admission, according to those who later heard the tape, was unmistakable. As the hours wore on, he began speaking about the past in ways no newspaper ever fully captured. He acknowledged feeling overshadowed by his children, especially Marvin. He admitted that his role as head of the household felt eroded, chipped away by fame, money, and changing loyalties. "He took my family away from me," he murmured. "He took my home. He took my place." Whether he meant emotionally, spiritually, or literally was unclear, perhaps even to him. When the officers pressed him again on what he meant by saying something had taken hold of Marvin, he shut down. He shook his head and replied, "There are things you don't understand, things I'm not going to say." His eyes went distant and cold, the gaze of a man who had reached the boundary of what he was willing or able to reveal. It was as if he had walked right up to the edge of a deeper truth and then backed away, leaving only shadows behind. When the interview finally ended, the recorder clicked off. The red light went dark. For several minutes he sat in silence, staring at his hands. One officer would later write in private notes that the man looked empty but strangely resolved, like someone who had laid down a burden he had carried for far too long. The public never heard that full testimony. They got the streamlined version: fear, self-defense, the confusion of an old man overwhelmed by a violent confrontation. That was the official story that fit neatly into headlines and sound bites. But in the lines that were left out or buried, there was a different picture. A father who felt both powerless and powerful, ashamed and yet justified, heartbroken and yet, in some small, chilling way, relieved. A man who claimed his son had become someone or something he no longer recognized. A man who seemed unable to admit the depth of his jealousy, resentment, and disappointment without revealing a motive darker than anyone wanted to face. And perhaps the most haunting question left behind is not simply why he killed his son, but what truth he was too afraid or too unwilling to speak out loud. Chapter 5. Aftermath. 40 years later, the real heartbreak. In the hours after the shooting on April 1st, 1984, the house at 2110 DeHaaf South Gramercy Place fell into a heavy, unnatural stillness. Yellow police tape fluttered in the warm Los Angeles breeze. Neighbors peered from behind curtains, speaking in hushed tones. Reporters clustered on the sidewalk, cameras pointed at a front door that had just become the scene of one of the most devastating losses in American music history. Inside, Alberta Gaye, a wife and mother who had spent decades trying to hold a fragile family together, made a decision she had never allowed herself to imagine. She left the house. Not for fresh air, not for a brief escape. She left for good. Within hours, she packed a small overnight bag, walked out the door, and never looked back. The place where she had raised her children, prayed with them, comforted them, and hidden them from their father's temper, became the address she would spend the rest of her life trying to erase from memory. By April 2nd, the news had spread across the country. Radio DJs struggled to finish their sentences on air. Television anchors paused mid-script as footage of Marvin's performances and award nights rolled behind them. Outside the hospital where Marvin had been pronounced dead, fans gathered with candles and handwritten notes. Some stood in silent disbelief. Others wept openly, as if the ground beneath them had shifted and nothing felt steady anymore. For many in the black community, the grief cut especially deep. Marvin's music had scored their heartbreaks, their marches, their joy, their survival. To hear that he had not died in a car crash or from an overdose, but from bullets fired by his own father, this did more than shock. It fractured something fundamental, shaking the cultural foundation Marvin had helped shape. By April 5th, the debates had already taken shape. Talk shows, barbershops, church basements, and community centers all turned into makeshift courtrooms, everyone trying to interpret what had happened inside that house. Was it self-defense? A mental break? A tragic accident in a volatile home? Or the inevitable final chapter of a violent cycle that had been spinning for more than 3 decades? The answers depended on who was speaking. Family friends said Marvin had been unraveling mentally for months. Cousins from Washington, D.C., reportedly maintained that the father had always been jealous, always resentful, always distant toward Marvin's success. Fans leaned into a more mythic narrative, the tortured genius, the prodigal son returning home, the fate-soaked tragedy that seemed written long before the final day. But the questions raised in those first days didn't disappear. They deepened. And 40 years later, they still linger. The first is the question almost no one dared to voice in 1984. Why did Marvin ever give his father a gun? That gift ran directly against everything he said he feared. For years, he had told people he believed his father might eventually kill him. So why place a firearm in the hands of the man he dreaded most? Some suggested it was a peace offering, a strained gesture from a son desperate for reconciliation, trying to extend trust where none had truly existed. Others believed it was driven by guilt, a way of saying, "I still care," after years of fast living, broken relationships, squandered money, and self-destruction. And then there were those who saw something darker at work. They believed Marvin, sinking under paranoia and despair, may have unconsciously set the stage for the very nightmare he had predicted, a tragic, self-fulfilling prophecy born from years of fear and unresolved trauma. The truth, tangled in memory, psychology, and silence, remains beyond full reach. The second question comes from what was recorded in police files, court documents, and medical reports. Why did Marvin Sr. show so few signs of mental instability before the shooting? Despite his age, despite the argument, despite the enormity of what he had done, doctors reportedly found no clear evidence of psychosis, no diagnosis of dementia, no breakdown severe enough to erase responsibility. He appeared calm, coherent, aware of his actions. A father who had just fired 2 shots at his own son did not fit the profile of a man lost in confusion. Instead, he looked, at least on paper, like someone who had completed an unbearable task with chilling steadiness. To many who read those evaluations later, that calm suggested that April 1st was not a sudden snap, but a release of violent exhale after years of buried resentment. The third question has echoed through documentaries, biographies, and scattered interviews. Why did the father seem almost relieved afterward? To the officers, he said, "I was afraid he'd hurt me," but according to some, his tone carried something more complicated than fear, an uneasy blend of shame and liberation. In the portions of his testimony that were not widely publicized, he hinted that a burden had been lifted. Some people saw that as grief that had gone numb. Others believed it revealed jealousy, finally unclenching after years in the shadows. And some, particularly those who knew how long Marvin's fame had overshadowed the family, believed that Marvin Sr. had always struggled with the way the world adored his son, elevating him to a place a father's authority could never reach. In that light, the notion of relief becomes unbearably tragic. Yet perhaps the most painful part of the aftermath was not what was said, but what remained unspoken. In the weeks following the funeral, critics dissected Marvin's artistry. Pastors preached about sin, downfall, and redemption. Journalists searched for angles, patterns, explanations. Fans clung to the records, crying over songs they suddenly heard differently. But beneath the public noise, a quieter truth emerged. Marvin's death did not begin the week he died. It began the first time he was beaten as a child. It began in hallways where fear replaced bedtime prayers. It began in the unspoken vow Alberta made to protect her children at any cost. It began in the simmering, invisible war between father and son. A war waged not only with raised voices or slaps, but with shame, rigid expectations, emotional wounds, and a constant battle over power and worth. Seen from that angle, April 1st was not the opening of a tragedy, but the end of one that had been writing itself for years. By the time the 1,980 seconds arrived, Marvin's life was already frayed: addiction, paranoia, romantic collapse, exhaustion. But those were only branches. The root system reached straight back into his childhood, into every humiliation, every sermon delivered like a verdict, every cold stare, every night he lay awake listening for footsteps in the hallway. Each of those moments was a stitch in a dark tapestry that finally tore open that Sunday afternoon. The heartbreak, 40 years later, is realizing that Marvin returned to the place he believed would finally protect him, the home of his mother, and instead stepped directly into the one environment that had always been his deepest source of fear. Today, more than 4 decades after the final shot, the truth remains fractured. Testimonies clash. Official reports leave out crucial moments. Memory is warped by pain. The family never truly recovered. Alberta lived the rest of her life away from the house, haunted by the scene she could not forget. Some relatives still refuse to speak openly about certain details, and even in its fuller form, the father's testimony leaves cavernous gaps, confessions overshadowed by evasions, honesty dulled by shame, explanations twisted up with bitterness. 40 years on, the same questions still circle like vultures. Was Marvin's death the result of a single catastrophic argument? Or was it the inevitable outcome of a life pushed past its breaking point? Was it self-defense, despair, or a final act of control by a father who had always relied on fear to maintain power? Maybe the most devastating truth is simpler than any theory. A musical genius went back to the only place he thought might save him, his childhood home, and died in the one space he had always been taught to fear. And so we are left with a question that refuses to fade, long after the music stops and the headlines disappear. Was Marvin Gaye's death a tragic accident, or the final chapter of a life that had been breaking from its very first pages? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe.